politics and activism usually revolve around the question of evil. What is actually an evil thing to do? How do you fight evil? Where does it come from? And so, of course, no matter what the topic is, usually one side claims that their ideology has the best understanding of evil and the best chances of fighting evil. And of course, the opposite ideology, the opposite party, they actually are evil, it is claimed. But what do politicians and activists actually understand about human evil? Now, do they read a bunch of books that contains scientific breakthroughs in our understanding? Usually that's not the case. So for the most part, people rely on their ideology to gain some sort of understanding of evil or a model of evil, right? So this has been around for quite a while. An ideological model of evil and scientific models of evil are fairly new. Now, unfortunately, all these different scientific breakthroughs haven't yet been combined into a singular, exhaustive scientific theory of evil. But you can kind of guerrilla style put these things together yourself to have a modern understanding. Now, of course, when the common ideologies were formed, science hadn't been around that much, and so people are actually using these outdated models, and that causes a lot of problems. So, for about 10,000 years, your ancestors lived under some sort of imperialistic system. So mostly it was a monarchical system, sometimes it was kind of a military form of government, or a cult-like government. So that basically meant that moral behavior was defined as submission. If you serve the king, if you serve the ruling class, if you do what they say, that was considered moral. And any form of resistance was considered evil, and of course was heavily punished. And that model, of course, is super primitive, but people tend to still cling to this sort of groupthink, this cult idea nowadays. Obvious examples are Russia and China. So no matter how they paint themselves, so they have a communist facade, right? Or they have a more conservative facade nowadays in Russia. It really doesn't matter because these empires have been traditional empires, right? So from the Russian czars to the communist phase to the present phase, Russia is just a very, very standard empire. It's always been like that. And China has used this communist facade, but when Mao took power, he was the dictator and the party was kind of the ruling class. It was kind of the new aristocracy. And the farmers, they were still locked into a serfdom system, just like it's been around for 10,000 years, right? So you were supposed to work on the field or in a factory, and you had no rights, and that was basically it. So if you call that Marxist, if you call that Leninist, or if you call that Mickey Mouse, it really doesn't matter because it is what it is. And so then, of course, especially the British colonial empire, they figured out the importance of science right around the year 1700, and they decided that a modern empire needed to make some changes. You needed to get people off the farms into the factories, into the schools to make useful things for the empire. And so the Enlightenment movement was not a movement from the people, for the people. It was a top-down transformation. So aristocratic circles, they had all the money, they had all the intelligence capabilities, and they had the science, so they could create the most important corporations, and they could control political parties. And so these changes in imperialism created our modern ideological system. For example, privileged citizens, which served the aristocracy quite well. These citizens did not want a lot of change, so they became the conservatives because they had a good life, comparatively. And so then you had the poorest people. Of course, they wanted to change everything, and they didn't trust the Enlightenment movement to provide enough change. They feared a new elite would form and there would be more exploitation. And that's where this idea comes from, that is central to socialism or communism, was the idea of the abolishment of private property. Now, of course, abolishing private property for everyone is a stupid idea. It doesn't work. But remember, this idea originally came from the oppressed masses. So your and mine ancestors, they were at least susceptible to this idea, right? Because obviously, if the aristocrats, if they can keep their money after so many years of tyrannical rule, the aristocracy could openly or secretly control future capitalism and future democracy. And then you had the sort of in-the-middle citizens who wanted change, but not too much change, and they became the democratic type citizens. You know, the Enlightenment movement. That's how they. That's what they liked. So there you have most of the modern ideologies that were born out of this controlled transition, this controlled transformation. And then, of course, you had traditional conspiracy ideology, and then, of course, you had libertarianism, which also became a thing. And that is basically it. And, of course, the most wealthy and the most capable in terms of intelligence and science, you know, the powerful dynasties, the clusters of dynasties, they wanted full spectrum dominance. They wanted to control all these ideologies without people truly realizing it. So every one of these ideologies offers an explanation for human evil and a sort of a plan how to combat this human evil. Now remember, this was before the later stages of science. Now most scientific breakthroughs about human evil, they have been made over the last couple of decades. So in the 1700s and 1800s, people didn't understand that sort of science. And so people relied on these ideological models. So the conservative idea is basically you have to have this traditional family, you go to church, and you celebrate traditions, and that's where all the good things come from, and deviation from that leads to evil. And that is it in a nutshell. And of course, in the right-wing sphere, you still have sort of, you know, even more reactionary ideas such as monarchies or aristocracies or that sort of thing. So this is the conservative model. Then the socialists, they treat socialism like a cult. They model it sort of after religious cults and even ancient ideas of government. So you got to have, mostly, for the most part, they think you got to have this monolithic party, and they decide everything, what gets produced, who gets paid what, and who has and who believes what. Right? So in socialism, they believe evil comes from the traditional family, patriarchal family, religion. And so these things, in the eyes of the socialists, they have to be eliminated or pushed back for the most part. And that's how you root out evil and you create this new socialist citizen of the future. Right? So you can see right away that in terms of left and right, they have the complete opposite understanding of evil and where it comes from and how to get rid of it. It's a direct polar opposite. One side believes this is good, the other side thinks it's bad, and of course the other way around. You know, what one side says is bad, the other side thinks is good. That's where most of these political fights and all this aggression comes from. Then you have these kind of in the middle people. They don't want they don't want a system that is too far left and don't want a system that's too far right. They believe in this sort of magical power of enlightenment. So they think that nerds, basically, and poets and musicians and philosophers, they think those kind of people created this change over the 1700s and 1800s. And especially in Europe, right? So people believe these nerds created this transformation. And so these in the middle democratic, or these in the middle people, they want to preserve that magic. Therefore, they think enlightenment is good, that's where all the good things come from, and deviation is evil. So they don't like things that are too far on the right or things that are too far on the left. But of course, it wasn't really the nerds that created this change. It was the aristocracy in secret, with their, for the most part, their intelligence networks. Now, in the United States, the emphasis was more on force because of the American Revolution. So that's, of course, why people celebrate the Second Amendment, because they think that this transition from monarchy to democracy, this transition was achieved by force, by war. And so this is a big difference between Europe and the United States. Then you have modern style libertarianism, which is oftentimes too primitive, right? When people simply believe that government per se is bad and private enterprise per se is good, right? So some people, they actually have reduced this libertarianism down to that basic idea. So the devil is always the government, and the saviors are always from private industry. But reality is way too complicated for that, for the most part. There was never actually a separation between governments and corporations. And libertarians oftentimes are not quite capable of understanding that truly. So you've seen some types of libertarians who celebrate the robber barons. That's one popular part of the libertarian sphere. So they worship the Rockefellers and the other industrialists, the ones that built the railroads and that sort of thing. Then, of course, you have extreme libertarianism, and they want zero government. So they even want to demolish any sort of constitution or borders or anything government. They want absolute zero government, and they believe they have found the key to solve evil and to solve it all. Classic conspiracy ideology is it's fairly simple to explain. It's kind of the myth of, I call it the windmills of Zion. This is something that was actually created by British intelligence. So they created this fairy tale that some very, very tiny, upcoming banking families, that they took over the British Empire, unmolested, unharmed, and using nothing but some loans and some intelligence sharing, which is, of course, ridiculous. The British colonial empire created the modern banking system. They created fractional reserve banking, and in order to make this work, the intelligence agencies had to control every part of it. So central bank, Bank of England, the private merchant banks had to be controlled, and the politicians had to be controlled. That's how they made it work. No other country at the time thought this could ever work, but it did, because everything was controlled. So the big merchant banks, the Rothschilds or the Barings family, they were all under the control of the aristocracy and their networks. And so, modern oligarchs are usually fake. They just do a job. They are the face. They are the name on the company papers. But true ownership, it lies within older intelligence networks. So basically, this is kind of the conspiratorial thinking. This sort of has morphed into this more modern idea of there's the good billionaires and there's the bad billionaires. And so you have to latch onto the good billionaires in order to save America. So this is where all the Q stuff comes from. This is where the John Birch Society, what the John Birch Society told people, to latch onto these problematic right-wing circles and billionaires in order to fight this big grand conspiracy. And so if you agree with a traditional conspiracy ideologist, if you agree with them, they will like you. They will think you are good. If you disagree with them, especially on fundamental aspects, they will totally hate you, consider you an idiot, or somebody who is submitting to government, or they will actually think you are part of a grand conspiracy. So this is how they define good and evil, and most of the time conspiratorial thinking is tied to more conservative thinking, right-wing thinking. So of course then you have the traditions and the values and all that stuff. So it's interesting to see that on social media, on television, in politics, in the political debates, people still use these old school, outdated models of evil. There's these explanations for evil. But what has science actually given us? So at first psychology was a new thing, and they had some trouble understanding the human mind. And of course, not everything that was published in terms of psychology was actually useful. But over time, they identified some central key personality disorders. So this was a true breakthrough, understanding what a psychopath is, right? Or an antisocial disorder, as it's called. Full-blown narcissistic personality disorder. And of course, there's always a certain spectrum. So somebody may not have a full-blown disorder in terms of narcissism, but it's still kind of narcissistic behavior. And it's not egotism, right? It's not being extroverted and outgoing and charming. That's and people who may be ambitious. Ambition and all these things, that's not narcissism. When you talk about narcissism, it is highly, highly exaggerated, and it's very, very destructive and self-destructive. A full-blown disorder in terms of narcissism means that this person is almost completely detached from reality. They make up their own reality in their minds, and they try to find people who believe in the fantasy, and they try to keep that fantasy alive. So not everybody you see who may be a scumbag, not everybody like that is a true narcissist. It's common nowadays that everybody calls everybody a narcissist, or people talk about gaslighting, which is kind of a stupid term. Stupid term that describes how a narcissist, for example, would argue, right? They constantly lie and they manipulate, and they always want to make you believe everything's your fault, and they twist things, and they're not using logic. They're using every scammy debate tactic they can think of. Because a narcissist always lives in the moment. What counts is the moment. They want to dominate in the moment, and they want to shine in the moment, and everything else be damned. So then, of course, a psychopath is a psychopath may be on a spectrum. So, for example, there's the Hare scale from 1 to 40 points. Some people, they may score a 20. Some people, they may score really low, and they may be too nice for this world. But if you get higher on the scale, that becomes an issue. Lack of empathy and predatory behavior, and this goes into the extreme. And so that was the first. Understanding personality disorders, sometimes they or pretty often actually, they come in certain clusters. So somebody might also be depressed and narcissistic, or be emotionally unstable, that sort of thing. So that's one breakthrough. Then you had brain experts, and people tried to look at brain scans, and they looked at differences between highly criminal brains, crazy psycho killer brains, and average people's brains, and they actually could detect differences. So there's advanced scanning technology, and a psychopath's brain really functions in a different way. And there's certain reasons for that. Some reasons are genetic. Some reasons are, abuse. For example, as early as in the baby stage and the toddler stage. So brain damages that can cause this the sort of atypical brain. So even in a blind study, experts could accurately tell which scan is from a psychopath and which one is not. Next, you had the geneticists, and they found a bunch of genes that put you at risk of developing, for example, antisocial disorder. If you have certain genes, you can still lead a normal life if you have nice parents and a nice upbringing, but they're still kind of different from the rest of us. And then if somebody with these kind of genetics, if they suffer abuse, then they can turn out really, 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 really evil. I mean, massively evil. Sometimes you have people that suffer abuse as children and they turn out to be okay. They are resilient. And sometimes you have people that suffer some abuse, but they turn out terrible. Right? So it's not always the same. You can't just judge everybody the same way. And people are really, really different. And so there are different subtypes of psychopaths. So, for example, you have some of the true genetic psychopaths, and you have sort of these brain damaged babies, that were shaken as little babies, for example, causing brain damage. Some psychopaths, they have a really short fuse, and they get into trouble a lot of the time early on. So these are the short fuse guys. Then you have psychopaths that can sort of control their emotions, and they can think long term, and they don't act spontaneously. They can hatch a plan how they're gonna deal with you at a later stage. And so this has been well understood. So in order to properly diagnose a person, you should have tests done by psychologists, psychiatrists, brain experts, and genetics experts. Right? So then you can actually assess a person. So more and more these scientific ideas are being combined, and this, of course, opens up a whole new host of opportunities, right? So, for example, should every person be allowed to serve in public office? Even that person may be a complete psychopath, narcissistic personality disorder. Because some of these guys, they can hide it pretty well. They know what you want to see. They know what you want to hear. So they can put on this fake mask of normalcy. And they can be charming, and they can be funny, and they can seem really cool. And so should a person like that serve in office? I think not. And many experts think that is a terrible idea. Right? Because if you look at, for example, the American norms, and so the American ideas of governing, it's the idea that every person has a conscience, and every person should be mentally equipped, to judge good from evil. And only if you have that sort of equipment, you can serve in a public office. But when the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights were written up, the science didn't exist. So our model of democratic government, of a republic, our model is really, really, really outdated. So this opens up the question of, shouldn't we test people that want to run for office? How can we make sure they don't cheat? Should they be tested repeatedly to eliminate cheating? And that sort of thing. So this has been debated by scientists, and this should be understood by many, many more people. So if you see a politician who's made it really far, chances are they are psychopaths and or malignant narcissists, or even emotionally unstable. Now, you'd see the horror stories, and usually if you're basically a Republican, you know horror stories of the Democrats. And if you're Democrats, you know the horror stories of the Republicans. But this problem is everywhere. And so you can't judge someone or a topic or an idea or a policy. You can't just judge it in terms of simple ideology. You can't just always revert back to that simplistic, outdated ideological model of good and evil. Of course, we are miles and miles away from a system where we can prevent psychos from getting into public office. But there are opportunities to apply science without actually getting someone to lie down in a brain scanner or just to be evaluated in a professional way. So you don't have to be a shrink. You don't have to become a shrink. You don't have to become an expert on personality disorders. You don't need to be able to properly diagnose people or treat people. No, you have to have a basic understanding of all the important factors, and then you can apply that knowledge, and then you can assess people better, and you can assess ideas and policies better. And so you may never be able to nail somebody down and say this is a psychopath, right? But you can get fairly close. You can make estimations. You can think of it as is that person worth the risk, right? Can we find somebody better who's less of a risk? Right? So without being absolutely sure, you can still stack the odds in your favor. And that is very, very important to do, because the biggest flaw of a democratic republic is that you're buying the cat in the bag. You're voting for people that you don't know, that you are very, very far removed from. And so when somebody runs for office, you can get some propaganda fluff pieces, and they get some confirmation hearings maybe. And then you get ideological people giving their opinion about them and that sort of thing. But you need to have a way more professional approach, even in local politics, right? I mean, you're giving somebody power and you don't know that person. You need to be able to really, really gauge if that person is a risk or not. So grab some good books and start reading. Start reading up on these personality disorders and what science has come up with, and then you can start applying it to your life. It's not just for politics, it's for your business acquaintances, it's for your personal life. I mean, the internet in the last couple of years has seen quite a few channels and people devoted to the topic of narcissism, but mostly in a relationship approach. So it's like for people that have suffered from a narcissistic relationship and they try to recover and that sort of thing. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a relationship, right? So narcissists are everywhere. They can be your business partner. They can be your false friends. They can be your colleagues. They can be everywhere. Start reading up on the subjects and then reevaluate what you see on social media, what you see on television in terms of politics. Subscribe to this channel so you won't miss any future videos. Like this video, comment on it, and please share it on social media.